You are listening to the Sod Pod, brought to you by Grassland Agro. Hello and welcome to the Sod Pod. You are joined here with me, Clodagh Bulger, this morning, and I'm also joined here with Peter Linden and John Brennan. So we're heading just into the second week of May now. It's hard to believe that, we're into the summer now, just the way the weather's been all along. I know you were saying there, Peter, that we've gone from, I suppose, spring straight into silage, so things are moving along fairly quick. But I suppose, look, the outlook is good for the weekend in terms of weather, so hopefully farmers will get silage cut and fertiliser out and things like that. So John and Peter, how are you keeping? I was away on annual leave there last week, so you might give me an update on maybe what's gone on while I'm away.
Good, thanks, Clodagh. Welcome back as well. I suppose we've been busy, I suppose finishing up a few things with regards to plan checks and stuff. I suppose we're in early May now. Still, HCs are pushing block sales and bits like that. I know our other colleague Stephen is busy with biostimulants for crops. And then something recently that we've been doing is training some of our newer sales reps doing a method called cut and weigh-in, which is quite topical at the moment, with farmers starting to cut a bit of silage. Cut and weigh-in is a method that is used just to kind of quantify what grass you have in the field. So that's kind of what we've been at now since you're away.
Yeah, sure. Look at just like that, it's similar to John, and I suppose look as you touched on it, kind of the spring into summer the way it was. Working with some of the farms too there. Plans had to change. We didn't obviously get the spring or the end of March, beginning of April that we wanted. So, with fertilizer applications and maybe lads not getting slurry onto silage grind and stuff like that when they wanted to. There was bits of chopping and changing with nutrients and stuff like that to try and make sure we've the crops rightly balanced. So, sorting that out, and as John said too, on the cutting ways now, we're starting to move on them. So yeah, sure. Look, it seems like that the summer workloads here now, and even for the farms as well. It's kind of there's a lot of stuff there knocked over the last week or so, and even probably going to be a lot more. Fingers crossed, the weather sticks it for another couple of weeks to allow them, get the first cuts cleaned off and sorted out.
Yeah, perfect. I suppose just as you were saying there, you had training there with, I suppose, our newer ATCs there in Kilkenny this week doing the pre-silage cut and weighs and the sugars and the nitrates testing. John, you might talk us through maybe the importance of taking a cut and weigh and maybe what you covered with the lads during the week.
Yeah, so Clodagh, first of all, I suppose the cut and weigh method it's a simple enough method really. Like you're going out into a field of grass near enough to the time of harvest. You're going out with a quadrant and a grass shears, as well as your PPE and stuff we were going through. And you're just basically cutting a quadrant of grass in the field. You're weighing it then with a kind of a digital portable scales, and you're inputting that bit of data then into a calculation to kind of work out your kilograms of dry matter per hectare. So the calculation is 40,000 because there's 40,000 quadrants in 1 hectare, multiplied by dry matter percentage in decimal form, multiplied by your grass weight converted to kilograms in decimal form as well. So that works out your kilograms of dry matter per hectare. It's useful data to collect on farm in terms of working out what tonnage you might have in the field for fodder budgeting, even if you might even need to take more cuts later in the year if it's a bit lighter than you would have liked. And I suppose overall it's a good way of kind of evaluating your fertilizer strategy for that first cut to see if you're hitting the target that you want. And it's good for an overall estimation of what you're harvesting to in the field.
Yeah, 100%. And I suppose just in terms like when we do the cut and weighs, we give the advice back to the farmers in terms of the sugars and the nitrates. I suppose what indicators we go back to the farmer with that, it's ready to be cut or whatever.
Yeah, so I suppose usually for first cut silage, just as kind of an example, you're typically talking 5 tons dry matter per hectare in terms of yield. Second cuts tend to be that bit lighter. So you're doing your quadrant and your grass measure and you're cutting to a residual height of 3.5 to 4 centimeters. So that's the kind of the cut and weigh part of it. Then you're also measuring sugars with a tool called a refractometer. And other services do this as well, like Chagas. You're going out with kind of a garlic crush in your hand. You're taking a few samples of grass. We talked about this earlier in the week, Peter, that you're kind of taking a sample of grass from a few different spots in the field. You're then kind of crushing that sample with the garlic crusher. you're kind of putting the grass juice that's pressed out onto the refractometer, and you're measuring using the brick scale what your sugar percentage is. In terms of a target, you're looking for at least 3% sugars in your grass, for a few different reasons. First of all, I suppose for ensilin, the more sugars you have, the more sugars that are there for the lactic acid bacteria to convert them sugars to lactic acid, which then achieve a good drop in pH, particularly in that early stage of grass silage fermentation. You want to achieve good ensilin, which is critical for good quality silage. We had a talk there yesterday from some external companies about the importance of good quality silage. Like, silage makes up a huge part of the diet of livestock in Ireland. So starting off with your simple sugar test is a great indicator and a good kind of bit of direction you can in terms of achieving good quality silage.
Something I would say there, just I noticed this year, like even there's a lot of variation in the tons that's coming off, like even not just from different farms, even within the one farmer. Just say, for example, he has maybe 6 or 7 different fields that's been cut for silage. Do you know, like they might have all got similar applications and nutrients. Fair enough, some of them would be balanced differently. But like there's such a difference even. Yeah, the average might be maybe say that 5.5 ton, but some of them could be up in a little over 6 and some of them just shy of the 5. Like, so when you're walking through it, once the covers are that high or that strong, it's very hard to see that. Only if you actually put the cutting way, the equipment on the ground and actually take it, like you'd never see that. But that is a huge knock-on effect then on terms of peas in case that's pulling out of the ground. Because I was only there last week, we were out with one farmer and he was, you know, it's something that's really important and that he wants to try and shift those peas and Ks up, like, so getting dialed in, I suppose, to that sort of information, he was very interested, you know, and visually you'd never see it. Only actually go out and take the data, you can actually plug it into the system and make sure all is balanced.
Another thing, Peter, we were talking about there was the effect of the dry matter percentage on your grass yield as well. Were you talking a little bit about that yesterday as well with the ATCs and the training?
Yeah. Look, a lot of lads were fairly familiar anyway, but just I suppose it's changed quite rapidly nearly over the last week or so, you know, but generally speaking, like obviously, like the likes of yesterday, hadn't much rain this week at all, you're probably up around that 19% dry matter, but then, you know, if you get 1 to 2 continuous days of rain or even maybe 3 or 4, obviously that's going to be slipping back. You know, that could be back to maybe 16%. And obviously just as important that you have that figure dialed in as well, because ultimately you could be getting inaccurate reading in terms of tonnage setting from maybe, you know, you could be 0.3, 0.4 of a ton off. And when you put that over a, you know, whatever it is, 30, 40, 50 acres of silage, like, you know, it's going to be quite a lot. So it's really just to make sure you're dialed in. And look, there's plenty of information online. Like even if you look at pasture base on their home screen, you can get the recent figures there in terms of where grass measures were taken and what the current dry matters are. So it's just something to be aware of. And look, a lot, to be fair, would just the influence of getting it wrong. Could be 0.3, 0.4 tons off, like.
Yeah, I think the Grass 10 released those dry matter figures. I think it's every couple of days anyway at the different sites across Ireland on their social medias and stuff as well if anyone's looking for them. So I suppose, Peter, you were going to talk a little bit about reseeding as well today. So if you want to go through maybe a little bit about selecting the right field or the importance of preparing a good seedbed or choosing the right variety, I suppose, to suit your system as well.
Yeah, sure. Look, I suppose in terms of first point you mentioned there in selecting the right field, like in the best case scenario, you're nearly working a year in advance in terms of trying to get weed control, under control. Obviously, that's something that's ongoing, you know, in terms of having that sort of sorted out before you reseed. But even from the P's and K's point of view, like obviously these new varieties are, you know, they're quite nutrient hungry, particularly with your perennial ryegrass plant. You know, so to help with the persistency of them when you go to the cost of reseeding, and particularly this year, I haven't heard any figures yet in terms of what sort of figures contractors are going to be charging, but like, you know, with the price of diesel, it's going to put a lot of cost onto it. So obviously you want to make sure when you are doing it that you are getting get it up and running and that it's going to persist long term. You know, and sure, like it comes back to the basics, your pH, your P's and K's. It's going to be very important. So to try and to have them in some sort of shape before you actually reseed, as opposed to maybe, you know, targeting fields that aren't maybe looked after. Because even from the clover piece as well, for it to survive, it's going to be very sensitive as well to that pH, P and K piece. Like, so just in terms of trying to get maximum return from it, but then also you can, you know, obviously any farms that are grass measuring, you get a lot of useful information there in terms picking out a pattern if you have a field that happens to be lower performing on a ton of dry matter basis, or, you know, even the spring we've had this year, you know, there's probably a lot of fields that were maybe poached a little more than we would have liked. Not to any kind of fault of management, just purely down to the difficult spring it was. There could be some other opportunities there. I suppose you touched too on the varieties, like there's various different varieties there, and it's going to come back to maybe what you intend to use that field for, be it as a grazing, is it a silage cut. Using the pasture profit index there is going to be key. Basically it's a bit like the EBI of the cow, where you get an overall figure in terms of a euro figure, and it rates basically the higher the figure, the more return per hectare that variety is going to return to the farm above that national average. There's various different sub-indexes within that, the likes of spring growth, summer growth, autumn growth, your quality, silage, the persistency, and even grazing utilisation. If you were to go, I'm going to just pick, say, something that's going into your a grazing field only. Obviously, the utilisation figures there is probably something that's going to be very important, because, being able to graze that down to that 3.5, 4 centimetres is very, obviously, look, what you get a high utilisation of grass, but even from a managerial point of view, that you're not having to, if it's unpalatable to the animals, that you're not coming in and maybe trying to correct it with some form of topping, or constantly leave it not grazing out the right residual, or ultimately then, coming in correcting quality with maybe taking it out as surplus silage or whatever it may be. And even other ones there, the likes of quality, is going to be important. That's ultimately the digestibility. So in other words, how usable it is to the animal for animal performance, be it weight gain, milk solids, whatever that may be. And obviously then if you go towards the silage mix, you're probably looking a little bit more in terms of what they return in tons of dry matter. Persistency again will be important, but I suppose the important piece there is to look at heading dates, that you're not having a real wide selection, that, you've parts of the plant heading early May, mid-May, and then late May. So you want it fairly narrow, but look at a lot of them be quite narrow by nature now anyway. So that's just kind of, look at, I suppose, an overview on that.
Peter, you mentioned there some of the figures and the cost involved in terms of a reseed, but in terms of investing in the reseed, you will get your money back in a couple of years on it. Like, reseeds tend to perform better in the shoulders of the year as well, and a topical one as well in recent years is their ability to be a bit more resilient when droughts are happening as well. So getting all those things you mentioned right, Peter, is crucial, and you will get your money back and your performance from your reseed. So it's good practice to be able to reseed a bit, every year.
The early reseed coincides with a very difficult workload time of year, coming out, especially this year that it was. Finish calving, maybe starting to breed silage, and throw reseeding into the mix, it is challenging, but it does tend to give a better opportunity to, I suppose, get the reseed established from, as opposed to the back end where maybe you're fighting a temperature or it's dropping. Whereas this time of year, obviously, it's climbing. We've daylight climbing as well, so it's a much better opportunity, I suppose, in terms of giving the grass and the clover plant to start. But even when you take the subsequent kind of managerial practices there, the likes of getting your post-emergent spray on, very often in the back end, it's if it turns wet, that doesn't happen. And then subsequently, if it's not happening, then you're probably not going to get to graze it out either, to try and thicken it up and, let light to the base of the sward. So it is, look at it from a environmental point of view, in terms of working with the weather, it is, and gives it a much better chance. But it's just in trying to manage the workload around it,
Have you anything else, I suppose, that you want to say, lads, before we wrap things up?
Really, I suppose if you are cutting a bit of silage and you're planning on putting out a bit of slurry ahead of maybe a second cut, to do it as quick as you can after taking that cut of grass, the response is better. I suppose the quicker you do get out with that bit of slurry.
Just on the reseeding piece, mentioned before that there is an extra allowance there from a phosphorus point of view. Just make sure you check with whoever's looking after your nutrient management plan that you have the allowance, because even though it's a legal allowance there, that that allows you extra 15 kilos extra P per hectare on a reseed, if you're already in the minus territory, it may not actually balance into a positive. So it's just worth to check that out, that you don't ultimately breach your phosphorus regulations.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Peter. And specifically for a farmer, I suppose that, it might give them some bit of an allowance. That phosphorus is very important for establishing the sward and getting the plant to tiller and drive on rooting and everything as well. So that's perfect, lads. I think we'll leave it there for today. I suppose, look, if there's any farmers there listening that want any more information, don't hesitate to contact us. The link to our website is attached on the description of the podcast as well. So thanks, everyone, and we'll be back again in 2 weeks' time.